All right. Good afternoon again. So we are at about 2 minutes after the start of the hour. Want to get started. We have quite a bit of content to get through and requests for feedback and comments as we go. So thank you all for joining. I'm Jim Rowland. I am the Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief at the IPA. I'm going to kind of co-host moderator with our com team, Tori. So just kicking off, this is the first of the workshops for what I would call a phase two of the mitigation plan process. Okay, just to first start from an agenda perspective, we have two major segments, a small one at the beginning here. So first is our introduction. I'm going to go through that with the logistics, orientation, and focus, and a real brief review of the 9.150 section. I'm then going to hand it off to Nate Miller for EAT3 to go through the RA study findings. There's a series of sections we're going to go through both for the methodology overview, near-term and long-term assessment, and some conclusions and additional questions for all of you as our stakeholders. Nate's then going to hand it off to Brian Granahan, director here at the IPA, to go through some initial concept designs for the mitigation plan development. Again, we're going to go through a number of items there and also request feedback as we go. And then I'll wrap up with next steps. One of the items I also have at the bottom here is, and we'll reiterate as we go, is there's a number of instances here that we're going to request feedback. So rather than a stop halfway through, there's going to be sections as we go. We're going to stop, request any feedback, questions, comments you have. Given the breadth of content, there's a possibility we don't get to all of the questions. So as we also go, I'm going to see if anyone has either questions they could send in or questions that could be added to chat. We can pull off to the side and answer in a later response out. First, disclaimer then, as we kind of continue, I'm going to read this just for word here. Any statements made during the workshop are intended to provide stakeholders with summary information of the intended RA study process. Resulting efforts or activities may change over time as necessary to meet the needs of the underlying statutory requirements. This slide deck is for informational purposes only and does not represent any legal interpretation or statement of the policy by any of the agencies, that's the IPA, ICC, or the IEPA, staff, or consultants. And any of the content presented herein or views and opinions expressed during the workshop are not do not represent a legal interpretation, statement, or policy, or statement of fact by the agencies, that is the three IPA, ICC, and IEPA staff or consultants. Appreciate bearing with that. So quick logistics. We have a number of topics, as I said at the start. We're going to have a series of stop points to seek feedback, questions, comments, and information as we go. So stay tuned for that. If you have questions in certain sections, you're not going to have to wait an hour to ask a question and then go back and tear back through various presentations or slides to get there. It's fairly well spaced out. There's three that we're likely to have on topic two when Nate's presenting, one at the end of Brian's slides, and then as time permits, we may have some more time at the very end to go through any last minute questions that you have. If and when you have questions, I'm asking you to use the raise hand feature. For those of you that may not use Zoom that much, at the bottom of your screens, there should be a react button. It looks like a little heart with the word react underneath it. There's a raise hand feature under that. So I'd ask you click that. We'll see you in queue. Tori and I will see it. And when we get to that break point to ask questions, we'll call on you. I'm going to do my best to figure out who asked in what order. But rest assured, one way or another, we'll get to you. Either we'll ask the questions and go through if we only have a few, or we'll kind of take stock down and maybe at the end we'll have some more time for questions as we go. Further, this workshop is going to be and is being recorded. That will be posted as well as this presentation that we have. We're going to try to get it up either later today or first thing tomorrow. So I'd say within the next 24 hours or so, go out to the IPA's Resource Adequacy webpage. This is where likely many of you have already been going to receive information on the RA study process as we've gone throughout 2025. So it'll be posted there for your quick access. Um, we're going to go through all the questions as best we can. In addition to the questions, though, in today's workshop, we're also going to be issuing a request for additional feedback to stakeholder questions we're going to be issuing by roughly the end of this week. So these questions are going to tackle both of the topics today, plus anything else that you all may have questions about. So when we go through that, again, look for those questions that are going to come out at the end. I'll repeat that at the very end of the presentation. And if you haven't done so already, please go out to our website and sign up for the RA distribution list. This will ensure that you're just part of any communications that go out, including those questions at the end of the week and going forward. Going to kind of breeze through these. Many of you will have already been familiar with this, but the focus today for the workshop is really segmented into two pieces: review of the RA study report, and then framing for the mitigation plan. So there's a number of pieces and sub pieces for that, and it's really designed for all of you, both to put you on the same foot as us with what we found through the first process, and then ultimately to pivot now to the next phase, which is the mitigation plan development. One of the other items that I have in the last bullet here is there will be links, and you're going to see IRP pop up here and there. This is not the IRP process. The IRP process and that is being initially led by the ICC folks. There'll be actually a brief notation at the very end of this presentation about that. Communications on that are forthcoming. It's going to evolve over time. So I just want to kind of focus everyone today with regards to what we've done with the RA report, the findings we had, and then the mitigation plan process that's forthcoming. Oops. And last but not least, quick refresh. I'm not going to go through again this in great detail. There's a section 9.150 you can look at. But really, if you kind of go back to the beginning that we started from, what we were trying to do with the RA study report and ultimately led to the report's issuance on December 15th of last year was an if-then statement. Effectively, when we evaluate the status of the market and its operators operating within the market, if the analysis finds a reasonably demonstrated RA shortfall, a challenge in the market to achieve the resource adequacy needs, then the IPA and IEPA will work together to develop the mitigation plan and submit it to the ICC, considering a host of different topic areas: renewable energy, storage, demand response, transmission, and then these other standards. So looking at CEJA targets and emission standards to see what can or should be done to adjust and accommodate and gap that shortfall. So that's really what we're here to do. There are some elements of SERJA, the Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act, just passed in October and signed earlier in January here by the governor, that tap to and link to the mitigation plan and IRP. So some of these is mitigation plan feeding elements into the IRP, and there's also some timeline considerations. We're not going to dive too deeply into SERJA here. Again, IRP things to be considered in a later meeting, but just know that there is and has been an evolution in some respects with regards to 9.150 requirements and determinations, what we're trying to do here, and IRP. So with that said, Nate, I'm going to tee you up and bring you in here to kick off the deep dive into RA study.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jim. And just for clarity, do you want to run the slides from your end and I'll just signal next?
Yep, that works.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everyone, for your attendance. Appreciate, in advance the comments and questions and discussion in today's workshop. We do have a lot of content to get through, but I want to just set the stage of expectations briefly. The RA study, of course, was published on December 15th, along with technical appendices, which are out there for your purview and future comments and questions. We can certainly take some of them in today's workshop as we have time. I'm going to go over the results, the key findings of the RA study. We don't have the time in today's workshop to cover everything in a comprehensive, exhaustive manner, but the purpose of refreshing and taking a summary view of what we find as the key conclusions and key analytical methodologies is to set the stage for the discussion today. So let's move on to the agenda here, Jim. What I'm going to go over in the next 45 minutes, RA requirements and timeline, very briefly, just setting that context as a quick refresher for everyone on the call, the RA study approach and methodology as well, again, as a quick summary, knowing that a lot more detail was provided in the report and appendices. And then I'm going to focus really on this next section, the findings for the near-term resource adequacy assessment over the period 2026 to 2035, and then the long-term resource portfolio modeling for RA assessment that we did using Plexos capacity expansion and some ELCCs generated by E3's loss of load probability model, and then just talk about conclusions. And that's where we'll transition into feedback from all of you regarding next steps. So let's move forward to the RA requirements and timeline and make our way through here.
And one quick note to that, sorry to interject, Nate. As we said, we're going to stop at a couple different spots. We're going to stop very briefly after the methodology section. Then we're going to stop after the near-term resources, the assessment, and then at the end of conclusions, just so folks know where to queue up. We're asking that you have your questions associated with that section, so we will stop as we go just to help things move. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. So very briefly, we wanted to put the resource adequacy study in the broader context of a lot of planning studies and processes that are currently ongoing in Illinois. This simplified diagram showing a number of different inputs to good planning processes in progress in the state, the list of concurrent studies and plans, as well as some prospective ones, think like the IRP, and then some action items. So in brief, the inputs going into these processes include the policy mandates, targets, and goals within the state of Illinois, core fundamental forces of load growth and electrification trends in the state and in the broader regional markets of which the state is a part, fossil retirement schedules, both in state and in external zones, plant transmission generation, technology costs in the future and market developments, as well as reliability requirements, planning reserve margins, and RTO capacity accreditation rules. Now, feeding into the concurrent studies, the resource adequacy study, focus of today's meeting, lives alongside the Renewable Energy Access Plan being undertaken by the ICC, as well as the Illinois Power Agency's ongoing and regular work to serve its own customers, the electricity procurement plan, and then the long-term renewable resource plan for the RPS procurements in the state. And then, of course, the forthcoming integrated resource plan established by SERJA. Those plans collectively will lead to a number of specific actions and interventions by state agencies in Illinois, as well as market resource development, and correspondingly will feed future inputs to future planning processes. Next slide. So just a quick recap here of what the RA study's objective is, and this is an objective set within the statutory legislative language. This is a joint study by the IPA, the IEPA, and the ICC with the core objective to understand, identify whether a resource adequacy shortfall will occur in Illinois during the 5-year forecast period, and if a shortfall is identified, to develop an action plan to address the shortfall, which, as Jim noted, may include a range of options, including the reduction or delay of emissions reduction requirements for in-state generators established by CEJA, or other resource needs, including renewable energy, battery storage, demand response, transmission that can address the issues identified. Over the course of 2025, we undertook the RA study and produced the report by December 15th. The study, as I'm sure you're all quite familiar, concludes that there is indeed a risk of an RA shortfall affecting Illinois and consumers of electricity within Illinois. This finding justifies the development of a mitigation plan by the agencies this year in 2026. So we'll carry forward. Starting off, the key conclusions that we have in the study really come down to 3 points. These are in the executive summary released on December 15th. Number one, there are resource adequacy challenges in the PJM and MISO regional markets, which are likely to affect the costs and reliability of electricity supply for Illinois businesses and consumers. This is not just an Illinois state problem. This is a broader regional challenge that affects the state of Illinois. We find that there is a risk of RA shortfalls specifically in the time frame from 2028 to 2031 over a range of scenarios. I think we've seen further evidence of that from the latest PJM capacity auction from 27-28. We see the major factors as a combination of load growth as well as fossil unit retirements and insufficient new resource development regarding accredited capacity entering the market. We've already seen high capacity prices, and the markets have been signaling and continue to signal the nature of this RA need in the near term. Number two, we also find that there are indeed pathways for the state of Illinois to achieve both its climate goals in the electric power sector while also ensuring grid reliability using available commercialized technologies. In other words, there are actions that can be taken in a possibility space with technologies that do exist and do not need to rely on the development of some silver bullet or something brand new into the future, at least to get started and walk down a path. And that is illustrated in the long-term portfolio analysis that I'll be talking about today as well. We also find, of course, that the state itself does have the responsibility and the authority and the policy tools to conduct planning and identify solutions and support implementing actions. The development of the mitigation plan alongside the IRP process established by SERJA, in addition to the other state processes that we outlined, are all part of that mix. So let's carry forward. Okay, so I'm going to cover now just a brief overview, restatement of our study approach and methodology in this assessment. The assessing resource adequacy for Illinois consumers does require answering three key questions as we laid out in the report. Number one, what is the expected reliability requirement over the RA evaluation period? Number two, how will the projected mix of existing and future resources contribute to meeting that requirement? And based on points 1 and 2, number 3 is what are the risks of achieving RA for Illinois in the future? In other words, the risks of those current and projected resources stacking up in accredited capacity to serve and meet the future RA requirement. Next slide. Wanting to restate, as many of you are likely familiar, and as we discussed at length in the report, that the state of Illinois does not exist in a vacuum and is a part of regional markets. And as part of these regional markets, there are two dimensions of resource adequacy risk. There's both physical risk and market risk. The physical risks are characterized by the loss of load probability, the outage risk for Illinois consumers. We are talking about resource adequacy here, so we're talking about bulk generation, transmission, deliverability, not local distribution system outage risks, just to be clear. So this is at the bulk system level. Is there adequate generation capacity to meet need over a range of conditions? How do resource additions and retirements in Illinois impact the balances in MISO and PJM, as well as the zonal requirements within the zones of Illinois in these markets? And are there any relevant transmission constraints in the planning horizon relative to the RA need? On the market side, this is around the cost and market price risk charged to consumers under the capacity market mechanisms in both RTOs. And that was something that we covered briefly in the RA study, and which will likely be a more prominent feature of the mitigation plan development. The next slide. So again, just a quick restatement that the state of Illinois is not its own grid. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is greatly intertied, interconnected, and synchronized to these broader regional markets. And what that means is that if there is a physical insufficiency of resources in either of the broader regional markets, that will impact the relevant market zones within Illinois. It's an interconnected system. And so Illinois as a state can only be considered resource adequate if both the regional transmission organizations here have enough supply and are resource adequate themselves. And that's going to be a key consideration and was part of the key findings from the study. The next slide. So how did we approach the modeling framework? A quick restatement here. We looked at it from the perspective of a near-term load resource balance projection and a long-term portfolio and reliability assessment. And I'll break those down briefly here. In the near term, the resource adequacy balance assessment is a method of taking today's system, today's peak load and reliability requirements, including planning reserve margins and capacity accreditations by different resources in the system at both the regional level and within the Illinois transmission zones of both markets, namely the ComEd zone in PJM and MISO Load Resource Zone 4 for Southern Illinois, covering the Ameren service territory. Taking the existing system and then projecting forward how the peak load growth and reliability needs will evolve over the 10-year period. What resources are expected to be added based on resources that are in active stages of development. This is not an assumption. We'll cover this in a moment, that everything in the queue nominally gets done on time at pace. This is looking at a much more finer level of detail at what's actually already in development coming online. What resources are slated to retire based on announcements by plant owners in the broader regional footprint, as well as resources that are expected to retire to meet seizure requirements within Illinois. And what does the intersection of load growth, additions, and retirements mean for RA balances over time? The long-term assessment purposely overlaps a bit with the near-term assessment, because in the very near term, what comes online comes online. What load happens, happens in the next year or 2 years. As you go out over time, you have more freedom to act, to intervene, to change the dynamics of what's happening in the system. And so what we did for the long-term analysis is we ran two different models: a loss of load probability model that actually evaluates loss of load risk. It's the same underlying model type that PJM and MISO use for their capacity accreditation and risk assessment. It's called RECAP, and it produces ELCCs by different resources, as well as evaluating LOLE and LOLP, which is loss of load expectation and probability. Then we fed that input or those outputs of that model into our capacity expansion model, Plexos. And we ran the capacity expansion model to understand what different resource profiles or portfolios could meet the simultaneous, concurrent energy policy and reliability needs of Illinois and the broader regional footprints under different scenarios. Next slide. All right, so that is the quick restatement of our model methodology and approach. Wanted to pause here for any core questions from the audience.
And if you have a question on the methodology or these pieces, hit the react button and raise your hand, and then we'll call on you and ask that you come off mute to ask your question. Yes, see one hand by Scott. Scott, please come off mute and ask your question. Thanks.
Thank you. Nate, I've been through your study and I read the spreadsheets with the details on the scenarios that you developed. I didn't see a line in those spreadsheets for energy efficiency as a resource. I did see a line for demand response, which seemed to reach a single level by 2030 and then stay at that level. It didn't increase further between 2030 in 2045. I can point to utilities that are making very different assumptions on the same issue, whether it's driven by an RA study or an IRP, which I heard will be dealt with by the ICC. But nonetheless, why isn't there more detail on the potential for energy efficiency as a resource, possibly a reduction in firm requirements or an aggressive scenario on demand response? In a sense, the surge requirement for batteries could be thought of as an aggressive form of demand response, but there's just this flat number out there. So could you explain that in this methodology? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I'll try to give a concise response to it. So number one, energy efficiency was not considered as a incrementally selectable supply side resource. Energy efficiency was considered in the overall demand projections as it was considered by the load forecasts of the RTOs, PJM and MISO, that we use as the baseline forecast for the study, as well as by the utilities providing their load forecasts. So think of it as being baked in an expectation. Why wasn't it included as a selectable resource? Well, the core focus of the study is on the near term, the next 5 years. Energy efficiency measures, there's a whole host of what those measures could be, and they look very different for industrial and commercial and residential customers, of course. But typically we think of them as incremental stock, programs where you are having to replace and do retrofits on individual building envelopes, replacing equipment over time. It is a much longer term arc of a resource, and in the nature of the load and resource envelope and drivers that we saw for the near term, it wasn't going to be large enough, fast enough to be considered as an incremental core response to the nature of the challenge. Now, demand response is a little bit different. Demand response, of course, can't be a developed resource, but must be done through a program. You have to incent load to be demand responsive. You have to understand what the attrition rate of that demand response is from load as that response is called. And there are existing demand response programs, and essentially that's what was formed as our basis for the flat line projection there, Scott. And now a core consideration, of course, is that a lot of the load growth is coming from data centers. Data centers could be demand responsive. If we were to simply assume they were, then the problem might go away, but that would be a blanket assumption that doesn't help us understand and characterize the nature of the need being driven by these loads and the nature of the risk. So I'd say that the demand responsiveness or load flexibility of data centers in our baseline assumption was informed by previous studies that we had done, including one public study in Virginia, the JLARC study, where data centers are not demand responsive from the data that we gathered from them. And I think this is very much a live, evolving topic. And one that's worthy of consideration and study, but not one that we wanted to assume away for the baseline characterization of the RA risk and need.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Scott. James, I see your hand up as well. Please come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. James Geniak with Union of Concerned Scientists. I have a couple questions around assumption inputs for data centers and plant retirements. Should I ask those now or at a different point?
And we're about to talk about them, but you could ask them now, and if we're going to cover some of it, I guess it's helpful to me to just keep it in mind now. Feel free to ask, and we'll get to it.
Okay. Yeah. So in the input file, the gross energy by component, which is helpful. It looks like for zone 4 in data centers, the assumption is basically no or zero growth from 2031 to 2045. So I just wanted to confirm that is correct.
Yeah, we will cover, I'm going to restate the peak load assumptions in the base case shortly here, James, but I may as well respond to the comment now. Of course, data centers, being the big key load factor driving some of the RA need in the near term. We took our data center load growth assumptions as inputs from the Ameren and ComEd utilities for their service territory. So that's specifically where they came from. That's based on provided information by those utilities. Now, certainly there is an envelope of uncertainty regarding how much data center growth will continue past the near-term period where we can see, hey, here's a facility, here are 3 facilities in development. We can make a reasonable expectation. We could do a near-term growth rate there. That's a lot of the basis for the near-term load growth from PJM and MISO regionally as well. It's ultimately anchored to data center load growth from those RTO's own load forecasts. But of course, that comes from individual load serving entities within the footprints. We did not take data center growth as a top line, everything happens estimate. We took a haircut to that in the PJM side and in the MISO side based on data provided by the RTOs. Without going into a much deeper discussion, that's the short version. So in other words, this is a kind of bottom up. These facilities are being developed. We see, activity here. We have a near-term growth rate on those loads in the broader footprints. And then we don't assume that that load growth continues unabated forever either in the study. Certainly, if data center growth does continue, it increases the RA need. And if it continues at a slower pace or flattens out, it decreases the RA need over the long haul and is a big factor of uncertainty at this point. But specifically for the Illinois zones, we anchored our forecast to those provided by the relevant utilities.
Okay, thank you. And these numbers are megawatt hours. Is the data center load growth assumption available in megawatts or gigawatts?
Yeah, we can look to provide that. We ended up, the way it was actually modeled, just to give you some understanding, is we modeled a representative 8760 data center load profile. And so we use that profile. All of our modeling was ultimately done using hourly load projections and the sampling of those hourly loads and the capacity expansion modeling. So there are hourly load assumptions that went into the Plexos modeling, at least. The peak load forecasts as well, and as the annual energy, again, was provided by the utilities for the Illinois zones.
Okay, thanks. And then on CEJA plant retirements, I looked through the materials and didn't see an actual list of units assumed to be retired in various years. And I'm wondering if the agencies are willing to or can provide that. The assumptions in the RA study basically align with a list I had tried to make based on various sources previously, but I think seeing those unit assumptions listed out individually would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we can all take that question back to the agencies. My initial response is that we have provided the megawatt by fuel type assumptions by zone that we used in the model to give everyone a common understanding of the aggregate impact of those retirement assumptions for the modeling. Plant by plant data, as I can say, is subject to an assumption, right? Because plant owners were having to read a lot of information, and the IEPA was the agency who provided this to us as E3, just to be clear. So we at E3 did not make our own independent assumptions about this. But obviously, it requires some assumptions made around what plant owners will or will not do and how they operate or invest in the plants. And it's not a definitely certain assumption on a plant by plant basis, and so we'll take that request back to the agencies.
Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate the questions. We're going to keep moving. I'd ask that if you have questions as we go about this, if you could drop it in the chat, that'll help us queue them up at the end as we have time, or just to kind of take them away. I saw some hands go up and down. So if you do have one, I ask you drop there. Nate, you can continue with your next section.
Sounds good. Let's page forward then, Jim. Okay, so just a quick restatement, an overview of the near-term load resource projections, the resource adequacy balance framework. The core components that went into this forecast is we are taking peak demand from RTO forecasts and utility data, as I just described. We are looking at the resource adequacy standards, in other words, capacity accreditation from the RTOs, as well as reliability targets, in other words, the total reliability need for the Illinois market zones, as well as the RTOs writ large under the RTOs framework. For the near term, the RTOs, these are the entities responsible for resource adequacy. They are the balancing authorities. And so we wanted to anchor our analysis to the numbers that they use for accounting and tracking and defining resource adequacy. That was important. Similarly, to characterize the existing system, both within Illinois and the broader regional system, we used RTO-aligned data and generator capabilities. They essentially individual generators all summed up by type and location from Energy Information Administration, or EIA data, as well as data corroborated by Velocity Suite, which is an independent data subscription service produced by Hitachi. Generator retirements similarly came as an aggregation of data from individual units, not just within Illinois, but really in the broader regional markets as well, MISO and PJM, from Velocity Suite and S&P Global, kind of two independent data providers. And then within Illinois, as I just described, we took assumptions around the impacts of CJ emissions requirements on in-state thermal retirements from the IEPA. And we looked at those as a sum of megawatts nameplate to accredited capacity by fuel type and by zone in the modeling. And then new resource additions were drawn from interconnection queues and specifically the new resource, the stage of progress of different power projects was aggregated from Velocity Suite at different defined levels of project development status. And those statuses were given different weights and treatment in the expectation of near-term resource additions. So in short, we are not assuming that everything that's nominally in the queues gets built as is, where is, and on time. That assumption would not be a reasonable assumption. So we took a finer level of detail there. And then the sum of all of these components together, existing supply, existing requirements for RA, the projection of additions and retirements, and load growth, produced the net effect of the RA needs into the future. So the next slide. So restatement of our core load forecasts. The sources of those load forecasts that I just intimated are coming from RTO published load forecasts from PJM and from MISO, as well as from load forecasts coming directly from Ameren and from ComEd. What we see in our load forecasts was that the peak load impacts PJM between 2026 and 2035 has a 46 gigawatt addition projected for peak load, which is quite material, 29%. That is still lower than the top line, headline estimate of everything happening perfectly. But it is pretty substantial. MISO, we see 21 gigawatts or 17% growth of peak. But in MISO Zone 4 in Southern Illinois, we only see a gigawatt of peak load growth over the 10-year period. And in ComEd, we see 8 gigawatts, relatively moderate growth between now and 2030, based on information from ComEd, and then a larger uptick in data center additions from 2030 to 2035 of 8 gigawatts, or 36% of the existing peak. Go to the next slide. So we also used the RTO capacity accreditation assumptions for resource ELCCs. That's the effective load carrying capability of individual resources. Again, it's important to use MISO or to use the official RTO values and the same RTO planning reserve margins in setting the RA requirement and contribution from resources in the near-term analysis. And these are the values that we used sourced from MISO from indicative direct loss of load, that's DLAW results, and the relevant studies that are listed below here. I won't go through each of them, but there's more information provided in the RA study report. Next. So this is a characterization of the total installed nameplate capacity of the generation resources in PJM and MISO, and then in the ComEd and MISO 4 zones used in the study analysis. What you see here is a 2026 level of installed capacity. The only reason that these stacked bars, these are all existing resources, decline in this projection in this chart is because this is only inclusive of the retirements from existing resources that were assumed in the base case. The next slide shows the retirements themselves. And so this slide is, these bars in cumulative installed capacity retirements are what are subtracted from the previous bars over time. As I mentioned, the generation retirements assumptions are driven by essentially announcements by plant owners across Illinois and the broader regional markets as well as the additional retirements assumed for in-state generators by the IEPA to comply with CJ emissions limits. So what we see here is that by 2030, 7 gigawatts of capacity in the ComEd zone is assumed to retire in this base case for CJ compliance. And in MISO Zone 4, we see 2.5 gigawatts by 2030 and a little over 3 by 2035. At the same time, PJM, a lot of that coal capacity has announced retirements of almost 20 gigawatts by 2035. And with some older gas units, we see 25 gigs of retirements there. And in MISO, we see up to 30 gigawatts by 2035. Again, this is largely legacy coal capacity that is quite old at this point. Next slide. So what about new resource additions from resources in development? So here you'll see the colors correspond to the resource type. So battery storage, solar, wind, offshore wind, gas, nuclear, etc. The hashed or solid shading corresponds to the stage of resource development, whether it's early stage or advanced development. And those come from underlying categories that are listed and provided by the Velocity Suite data subscription, and those are detailed in the report as well for some additional information. Generally, what we can see, of course, is that the total cumulative capacity being added to PJM and MISO over the near-term horizon from 26 to 35, well, most of it is online by 2030, because we'd expect that resources in 2035 maybe have not even entered the queue yet in some instances. So again, we're just trying to block out the expected resource additions from data that is available today to understand the envelope of need and how that changes. Most of those resources are in earlier development rather than advanced development. And in short, when you translate 80 gigawatts of nameplate capacity in PJM and almost 70 in MISO as in nameplate capacity to accredited capacity to reliable resources based on ELCCs, most of that solar that is in the queue, which is mostly solar, is not worth a lot in terms of incremental reliability value. And so that's one of the key challenges here, is that yes, a lot is being added to the grid in top line nameplate numbers, but for reliability contributions over the range of expected risk, we see it's much less. It's only 20 gigawatts in PJM and 20 or 30 gigawatts in MISO. The total stacked bars change over time according to projected changes in the ELCCs. So let's go forward a slide. Within Illinois, the picture is largely similar to that of the broader regions, where we see a lot of solar and wind in progress in Illinois, but the actual accredited capacity is far lower. 9 gigawatts in ComEd turns into 2 gigawatts of RA resource, effective expected generation during critical peak hours, whereas in MISO, about 11 gigawatts turns into 3. The next slide. So how does it all stack up when you add it together? The peak loads, the expected additions, the expected retirements. The as reported scenario is exactly that. It's the data from all of those sources as it is stated. And when you put those cards all on the same table, this is the picture that comes together. We're in PJM by 2030, up to 12 gigawatts of RA need. In other words, a shortfall or additional resources required to not have a shortfall emerges. That grows without any further resource additions to 28 gigawatts by 2035. Whereas in MISO, we see 8 to 32 gigawatts over a similar period as the key RA need. So clearly more resources than those that are currently in active development are needed in a relatively short time frame to bridge this gap. Next slide. When we look at the same picture for the same data for Illinois zones, we see that the ComEd zone needs up to 3 gigawatts of additional resources by 2035. And MISO Zone 4 does not appear to need any additional resources. Now, I want to qualify this because the solid blue bars on top here are the capacity transfer limits. In other words, transmission, interconnection, capability during peak hours. This was drawn from RTO assumptions. What we see is that the ComEd zone by 2030, with incremental load growth and the thermal retirements, will begin to need to rely upon its transfer capability to meet its in-zone reliability requirements. In other words, imported RA resources, not necessarily imported generation, but imported capability for generation. The MISO zone, by around the same time period, 2031, even with moderate growth, it's the nature of the retirements in that zone and the additions not being firm capacity as much that require the reliance on imports. Now, by itself, you could look at this and say, well, the Illinois zones appear, fine from a zonal perspective, but then it actually becomes critical that the RTOs themselves, the broader regions, are showing up short in this same time period. And so that is what creates a risk for Illinois' own resource adequacy. Let's go to the next slide. So we know there's a lot of uncertainty in these various factors. And so we wanted to characterize the if-then effects of some of these major components to understand how sensitive this finding was to some key factors, namely the delay in resource additions. What if some of these resources are delayed? We see a lot of risk for those with current requirements, supply chain challenges, some interconnection challenges. And we also see the potential for the delay of retirements. Now, I want to note that, of course, these two different kinds of delays move in opposite ways for resource adequacy. If you delay new resource additions, it creates a larger RA challenge because resources you're counting on are not coming on as fast as you would like. But if you delay your retirements, it makes your RA need easier because you have more of that capacity online for longer. Now, why did we consider a delayed retirement scenario? I want to be clear, this is not just the delay of in-state Illinois generation. This is also delayed retirements from these plants in the broader regional footprints, which, as you saw on the previous slide, are mostly coal plants. When capacity prices are very high, it creates an incentive for plant owners to continue to operate those plants, to earn those revenues. And so we thought a reasonable scenario to say, well, how much of this challenge potentially could be solved or might be solved if many plant owners opt to extend the operations of their plants during this near-term tight window. So the next few slides will illustrate and summarize the findings from these two sensitivities. So this slide just sets the table for the following slide, and I'll talk through this briefly. So this is the as reported scenario, the same scenario we were just looking at, but restated so that you're seeing the installed capacity of the as reported resource additions in nameplate, not ELCC here, first on the far left. In the middle, again, is a restatement of the as reported assumptions of retirements, and the right is the resulting RA need. So again, PJM you see here going from 1 gigawatt short in 2029 to 28, and then MISO from 8 to 32. These are the same gaps that we just talked about in the previous slide. So let's move forward one. And this is where we are adding some additional information. So now you can see that the left-hand side, this is the resulting delayed resource additions that were modeled and assumed in this scenario. And the resulting RA needs, if you delay these resource additions, are shown in the solid red bars on the right. Note that the hashed or stippled red bar in the middle, or actually on the far left-hand side, are the as reported, the same numbers that we were just looking at. So if you page back first briefly, Jim, you can see that those bars from 12 to 28 and for PJM, and then page forward, are still showing here from 12 to 28. But if you delay those resource additions, then in 2030, that need goes from 12 to 26. So it's quite substantial. Now, consequently, if you, these are not simultaneous or compounded scenarios. So the red bars are if you just delay resource additions. Now, consequently, if you keep the same base case of as reported resource additions, but you just delay retirements, that is the result in the solid orange here. And so you can see there that the RA shortfall decreases over time relative to that base case because you have, the continued operation of some of this capacity, but you still end up with an RA need in all three of these scenarios. So the next slide will illustrate this for the ComEd and MISO for zones. So in ComEd and MISO, here's the as reported resource additions and retirements. And the result, again, that we talked about before, is that of a 32 gigawatt peak in 2035 for ComEd, we see a 1 to 3 gigawatt shortfall, which is about 9% of peak, plus a 6 gigawatt import reliance. Now, again, if the RTOs are short, then that 6 gigawatt import reliance is probably not reliable. And that is another key risk here. In MISO 4, that 11 gigawatt peak load in 2035 is compared to a 3 gigawatt import reliance, which is about 27% of peak. So the next slide then shows our scenarios, the same kinds of scenarios we just talked about, the delayed resource additions and the delayed retirements. And so here, if we delay our resource additions to the zone on the right-hand side, we can see, of course, that it sort of accelerates the RA need. It's the solid red bars. Apologies for the swapping of colors here on the bar charts. If we delay our retirements, it alleviates the need. So delayed retirements of coal in the ComEd, all else equal, reduces the shortfall by 2035 to zero, but you're still relying on 6 gigawatts of imports, again, when the RTOs themselves are short in this period under these assumptions. So it doesn't alleviate or fully address the RA need and the RA risk by itself. MISO 4 is a similar situation in the sense that there is still a reliance on the import capability under all three scenarios. The amount of that reliance changes a little bit. So again, the restatement of the problem here is that a regional reliability need caused by regional forces of load growth and thermal retirements and additions in MISO and PJM writ large is the major macro driving force for a reliability challenge for Illinois. Within Illinois, Illinois relies upon capacity from these other markets in the forecast and also has an additional need for some new resources beyond what the transfer capability and existing resources are expected to be. Let's go to the next slide. So these conclusions were all outlined and described in the report. So I'll just tick through them and then we'll pause for some questions here from all of you. First, we see that capacity prices in both markets are hitting record highs in response to tightening margins. And that has a real cost for consumers, as I know you all know. We released the report basically, and then soon after, saw the results of the latest PJM capacity auction, which indicated a problem that was very much in line with our projections and even a bit more pronounced for the 27-28 period. There is very clearly a risk of an RA shortfall in both RTOs, which will impact Illinois in the study horizon. And as we respond to our mission for this study, that indicates a need for a mitigation plan development this year. We see that load growth, largely from large loads, data centers, is the major driver on the need side, but also thermal retirements, not just in Illinois, but in the broader footprints, are another key factor creating this need. And new nameplate capacity, new additions are quite large, but of course, accredited capacity is much lower as we account for the reliability value of these specific resources. And finally here, 2 points that are important to voice over is that, again, even if Illinois zones appear resource adequate internally, it's these system-wide RA shortfalls in the broader regions that could make the imported capacity unavailable, or it still expose Illinois to reliability risks because the broader market is at risk. And then finally, delaying emissions-driven retirements of Illinois thermal resources will move the needle on available resource need. If you keep resources on it in Illinois longer, it reduces the need for new resources, all else equal, but it by itself does not solve the RA problem. So I think that's a good place to pause for questions here.
Okay, thanks, Nate. So again, if you have a question, please raise your hand by going down to the React button and hit the raise hand function. We'll queue you up for a second here, and then I'll ask you to come off mute to ask your question. See, one hand popped up. Kiki, please come off mute and ask your question. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Nate. This is Kiki Velez with NRDC. So you mentioned you modeled a scenario with delayed additions. I'm wondering if there was consideration of running sensitivities with actually potentially faster additions. And the reason I ask this is I'm wondering the extent to which the study might have considered things like advanced transmission technologies or surplus interconnection service changes in PJM, or other like GETs, other things that might speed up interconnection for new resources, new renewable resources. And maybe that, well, I know that there were other scenarios that you all ran for addressing the resource adequacy shortfall. So maybe those would have been considered under those scenarios, but just wanted to sort of raise, I guess, the extent to which those options were considered in the study.
Yeah, Kiki, it's a good question. The short answer is no, we did not include an accelerated resource addition scenario. And certainly that's worthy to note. One of the reasons why we did not include that is one, we were looking to understand the kind of envelope of risk, and for a number of reasons, the current development environment for renewables, especially given federal policies and actions, the removal of tax credits, foreign entity of concern requirements from the July reconciliation bill, which really kind of forces everyone to take an extra close look iteratively through their supply chains for Chinese content. The tariff policies in place, there are a lot of real challenges to sourcing and developing projects. And we think, from our perspective, advising folks in the industry over the last few years, it's more downside risk than upside in terms of being able to accelerate projects. Doesn't mean there's no opportunities there, certainly, and those are worthy of exploration. But that was just the macroeconomic picture that characterized our focus on the delay scenario rather than the acceleration scenario, I suppose. I think the other thing that's important to note here as well, Kiki, is that while wind and solar resources are being added in pretty large numbers, nameplate wise, over the study period, and they are being driven as new sources of generation energy and clean energy, they don't have very high reliability value in terms of ELCCs by themselves. So it takes many, many more megawatts of solar and wind to have the same accredited capacity value for the nature of the risks that the system faces for reliability. And so even if we were to look at a scenario of kind of greatly accelerated wind and solar additions, those aren't the kinds of resources that are likely to make up for this shortfall by themselves. It's not saying they don't add a lot of value to the grid for a number of reasons, but it's just this particular kind of capability to turn on power during a winter storm, for example, that characterizes reliability risk, are just two different components that the system is solving for. And we're trying to sort of focus on what the reliability need is and how that intersects with these other issues.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I see there's two kind of question comments in the chat here. Let's see. One from Scott. Nate, rather than me reading, I'll read to the group here quickly, but can you see it there so that you can probably kind of self-read, or I can just read it over the lines here?
Let me see.
I think it might be good if someone reads it just in case
Yeah.
someone's listening on the
Yeah.
phone, because I think
Yeah,
we
I
have
just
people who
yeah, no, I appreciate that. I just realized that Nate might need to read as opposed to listening to me kind of drone on as he tries to formulate a response.
got it.
So the question here comes from Scott. So the gap identified, for example, in Northern Illinois ComEd region was modeled on RTO assumptions, but your scenarios do provide spreadsheets for the ComEd territory. ComEd has already drafted an updated EEDR update in response to Surja, FYI. And in terms of your explanation on E not being incrementally selectable, in a similar situation in the 90s, ComEd was able to provide commitments to DR. In the 2000s, CA achieved comprehensive statewide results. This month, Con Ed in New York issued an RFI on potential benefits of aggressive push on non-emissions alternatives, including NWA, non-wires alternatives. And the governors of all PJM states are pushing for more selectable alternatives. And your point about the data centers calls out for action. Are you saying that the grid operators can't influence commitments to E and DR? So I think this also goes back to a little bit of methodology conversation before. So maybe briefly touch on it, and we'll go. I think the second question is with regards to some events and things that we should talk about in this section.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. There's a lot to unpack there. So for the sake of time, I'll try to just respond to a couple key points. One is that a non-wires alternative is really a transmission solution and not so much a resource adequacy solution for resource. Broadly speaking, we are focused on characterizing resource adequacy. What we see in general is that transmission in terms of import capability during system critical hours is not the major constraint for Illinois. It's generation capability during those critical hours from resources that can provide it. That is the core feature there that we find. I'm certainly not saying that EE and DR are not incrementally selectable, but wanting to note that the nature of the study, the core focus was understanding, given all of these trends and forces of expected load growth, expected resource additions, is there a risk to resource adequacy? Is there a potential for a shortfall? And what we find is yes, there is. If we were to, I mean, one can certainly design a study that assumes there are incrementally selectable demand response resources that fill the need, but you'd still need to execute on all of them and carefully understand what the nature of those resources needs to look like in terms of price response and program design and who is dropping power when and how many times is required. What is the ELCC of those resources? There's a lot that needs to go into that to understand how those resources can be brought in. We included as an assumption that the existing resources for demand response stayed as resources in demand response to help us understand the emerging reliability need on when all the other cards were on the table. And so we're not saying that those resources are not part of a potential solution. That's certainly part of a mitigation plan development. But to understand the first question of, is there a potential problem? We did not want to presuppose that those solutions would simply appear, right? We wanted to see, with the cards that we have on the table, how do they stack up? And that's the intent of the study in this first phase. I hope that helps to answer some of those questions.
Thanks, Nate. We have two kind of follow-up questions, one on extreme weather and the other on verification of legacy retirement. So the one on extreme weather, were future extreme weather events such as Winter Storm Uri and Elliott considered in the evaluation of near-term RA risks?
The short answer is yes and no, and I will clarify that. In the evaluation of RA risks, you need to look at a probability distribution of potential system conditions. And that's exactly what we did. We looked at a 40-year history of weather conditions. Within that history, Winter Storm Uri was in there. Winter Storm Elliott is in that history across the United States. So yes, they are part of the distribution of risk. And in fact, so there are two different facets to it. One, for the near-term reliability assessment, we used values for capacity accreditation and need from the RTOs. PJM and MISO specifically looked at those winter storms and the way their entire methodology for the numbers they used and the planning reserve margins they set are what we used for the near-term balance, because those are the representative authorities in setting what those standards and counting methodologies are. In the longer term, for our capacity expansion, that answer the question, how might these reliability contributions from resources change over time? E3 ran our own loss of load probability model looking at a 40-year history of the distribution of weather years and conditions. And that model informed the ELCCs by resource that we used to understand what kinds of future portfolios might be addressed or might be developed to address the climate and reliability goals of Illinois. And so sort of two different places where those risks were incorporated.
Great, thanks, Nate. And then the second question, and this will be the last, just for folks, we'll again queue up. You can ask questions and we'll queue them up for the end of this section anyway. How are legacy retirements typically verified? Is this public information or is it something that needs confirmation directly from the plan owners as referenced earlier in the presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're relying on public announcements for the base case of plant retirements. Now, certainly there is a time window where an owner commits to a retirement, and the retirement is incrementally put into place, right? We talk about like staff drawdowns, the slowing and stopping of plant capex, and all the various pieces that go into the retiring of a large plant that's been operating for 50 years. So we did not have the time, or space to reach out to individual plant owners and get confirmations or any kind of updates of their retirement schedule, which is one reason why we used a blanket extended operations sensitivity just to understand the broad parameters of the RA risk in the market. How much is mitigated if all the plants just extended their operations? Is there still a risk? That was a trying to understand a boundary condition, basically, of uncertainty. But the core assumptions of plant retirement dates are based on publicly reported information, as summarized specifically in Velocity Suite.
Great, thanks, Nate. There's an additional follow-up that if we get time at the end from Raj with regards to the extreme weather, we'll circle back to. So we'll highlight that when we get there. All right, next section, the long-term assessment.
Okay. So for the long-term assessment here, we're just going to go over briefly the model approach, as I mentioned earlier, and then we'll talk about some of the results. So first, we used two major models to perform this assessment. One is a reliability model or a loss of load probability model. That was RECAP, which is an E3 tool that we have used for many years in many different public planning processes, integrated resource plans, system-wide ELCC studies, and the like. And then the second is a portfolio model, which is a capacity expansion model. We use Plexos LT. It's a piece of commercial software produced and sold by Energy Exemplar. That model was our optimization model that takes in input regarding load and resource costs and RPS, renewable portfolio standard, and other kind of climate goals into it. as well as ELCCs, the reliability contributions of different resources at different penetrations coming out of our loss of load probability model. And then the Plexos model selects a resource portfolio that meets the stated policy targets as they were modeled, as well as the reliability needs as they were modeled, at least cost over the modeling horizon, which in this case was from 2030 to 2045, subject to specific scenario constraints. And that modeling ecosystem took in all of our load inputs and resource costs, and then we validated how well the model chose resources for a reliable mix by putting portfolios back into the reliability model, and we reported the results. So we designed a number of scenarios as we described in the study for the capacity expansion exercise. There is a base case, and then there was a CEJA extension case, a no new Illinois gas case, and an Illinois net zero and a low battery cost case. We can see here on the table on the right, these are how these different factors are related across the cases. So, for example, I won't go through every single cell of the table, but our base case, as we characterized it, new gas combustion resources were allowed to be built in Illinois. In this case, those combustion resources were assumed to be hydrogen ready or otherwise capable of running on renewable natural gas or other fuels, but we characterized the cost and performance based on a hydrogen ready new CT. We did not require those units to run hydrogen for combustion for the sake of the modeling until 2045. We modeled the CEJA-driven in-state fossil retirements in this case as occurring according to the schedule assumed by the IEPA. And we used a base case for battery costs. And you can see in the table here how some of these other cases were designed based on some high level, these are not existing laws per se that say you cannot build new gas in Illinois. So we wanted to just parameterize or otherwise say, if this, then this, if this, then this, how would these different factors affect an optimized portfolio selection? Let's go forward. So how did we represent the complex interconnected system of Illinois and these broad regional markets for the sake of this resource planning tool, this Plexos capacity expansion model? You can see here that the model, because this model is also the same model that E3 is using to support the Renewable Energy Access Plan or REAP study being performed by the ICC. So we wanted to represent the individual REAP zones within Illinois as zones where resources could be built, and those zones are on the right. But then broadly, we also represent that these regional markets have their own zones and loads and reliability requirements. And so this is the model topology, and the transmission lines are the connections here of the arrows with the capacity, the transfer capability of the transmission lines between individual bubbles, the bubbles being the different load resource zones. You can see here just a couple items to note. That MISO South was not modeled explicitly as a full load and resource zone. It's a relatively limited transfer limit to the rest of the MISO North footprint, and it's modeled simply as a net exporter to MISO North with a very limited amount of net exports over the study horizon. It's a simplification. The Illinois zones are each represented broadly as the MISO 4 and ComEd, and they've been downscaled as mapping to these REAP zones on the right. And then finally, Mid-American and other Illinois munis and co-ops are not shown in the figure, but their loads and resources were included as parts of the larger zones in this footprint. So they were not excluded from the study. They just were not represented individually. Next slide. So what do we see as a result? This model is choosing portfolios over time for both the PJM and MISO regional footprints as well as the Illinois zones itself. So it's doing both at the same time. And that helps us understand some kind of cause and effect differences of different assumptions, and how the regional markets may select different portfolios from Illinois and how the two are interrelated over time under these different assumptions. This was not meant, just to set the stage here, to be the singular decision-making point of, okay, so we're going to build this portfolio. This was intended to be an illustrative planning exercise to understand the nature of the resources from available technologies that could be selected to meet this series of needs on both RPS climate goals as well as reliability in the study horizon, and understand how different sensitivities could change those results. So first, starting with PJM, we see here on the left, this is the total installed capacity by resources in nameplate, and this is in gigawatts, versus the accredited capacity, the RA value or ELCC adjusted capacity on the right. So we can see, for example, that from 2030 to 2045, we're going from about 275 gigawatts to 425 gigawatts, substantial build out of resources. But on the right, in accredited capacity, that only goes from about 200 to 230 or so. A lot of that is front of meter solar. There's additional building of wind. And you'll note that the model selects 4-hour lithium ion batteries in an initial build out to 2030 to meet the near term RA need, and then doesn't really choose batteries in the base case beyond that because their ELCC value has already saturated largely in the market. And the model sees that additional combustion turbines to be a cost-effective source of future capacity under this scenario, even as you can see the coal retirements are happening in the market over time. Next slide. So for MISO, we see a little bit higher mix of wind relative to solar in the market just by economics. And we see a similar story with regards to batteries and gas in the base case scenario. We're not assuming that states in PJM or MISO that don't currently have carbon policies or greenhouse gas emissions limits or RPS policies adopt them in the future. So this is not a policy plus scenario. This is a current policies scenario, okay? And so what we see here is that we see a mix of combined cycles and CTs being added to meet MISO's reliability needs. As coal is retired, it's being replaced mostly with combustion turbines. And there is an initial build out of short duration battery storage as a cost-effective way to meet the near-term capacity needs. But once the ELCCs of that short duration storage are saturated, the effective cost of each battery in terms of the cost per unit of effective capacity becomes much, much higher over the long term relative to new combustion turbines. The renewables that are being added in the MISO footprint are to meet energy needs as well, and they do provide a form of capacity at ELCC rate, but they also provide renewable energy to meet the renewable energy goals modeled in the region. The next slide. So now we're going to be looking at the ComEd and MISO 4 zones, and to keep an eye on time here, so we'll get to the next batch of questions soon. The ComEd zone over time, there's a lot of behind the meter resources. I want to be clear that this scenario and the assumption for distributed solar was not selected by the optimization model. This was an assumption that the IPA continues to follow the allocation priorities for the RPS and specifically solar programs in Illinois over time at a certain ratio. So this was an exogenous input rather than an output of the optimization model. And that is what's driving the significant build out in behind the meter solar relative to front of meter solar in the model. Similarly, you'll see a growing share of wind. And what we did, there's a very extensive documentation and description of this modeled RPS constraint in alignment with the long-term plan from the IPA in the technical appendix to the report. So anyone with detailed questions, I would refer you to read that section. We try to document and clarify everything as best we could there. The top bars in the stacked bar chart are actually the import capability here. Oh, this is PJM. Yeah, ComEd. So what is not shown here, I think it's a little bit hard to see. It's not offshore wind. This is actually import capability from transmission. So just wanted to clarify that. So we see that over time, we are adding, getting up to about 35 gigawatts of accredited capacity in the zone. Go forward. So for MISO 4 here, in terms of its resource mix, a lot of solar and wind is being added as the fossil is assumed to retire by 2045. We see only about a gigawatt of short duration battery storage. A lot of the solar is being added in this zone to meet the broader Illinois RPS targets. And the zone is relying more and more on imported capacity over time, over its transmission capability. The next slide. So this is a comparison across some of the different scenarios for the PJM ComEd zone. Again, for time and space, we don't have a report out of everything that was in the report in this slide deck today. But just to give you a sense of some of the major trade-offs that we find here in the modeling. Number one is if you do not allow any new combustion turbine resources in state in Illinois, you have to build out a lot of battery storage in order to meet the reliability need. Now, we did not include, as is documented in the report, explicit assumptions around emerging technologies such as long duration storage of different forms. We did include as an option for the model to build new nuclear units. And in fact, in the no new Illinois gas scenario, it does choose new nuclear by 2045. But the total amount of resources built in this scenario in nameplate capacity is much higher than in other scenarios. And higher in cost, but the accredited capacity is meeting the same RA need as the other scenarios. In the base case, you can see here that you're building a decent number of new gas CTs, combustion turbines, that would run on a renewable fuel or hydrogen by 2045, but not beforehand. The emissions from these resources in our sample dispatch, which is a limited form of analysis in this regard, are not very high because generally you are building these turbines for their capability, their insurance product value for reliability, and not, and you're building wind and solar for your decarbonization trajectory. And then, of course, the last thing to note, which is relatively straightforward, is if you were to extend the operations of existing in-state thermal resources, it reduces the amount of new CTs or other accredited capacity that you have to build because you're retaining an existing resource rather than replacing it with something different. The next slide. So this is a similar comparison across scenarios for the MISO Zone 4. And you can see that ComEd has a bit more of a challenging kind of peak need, RA need, relative to Zone 4, which has a lot of transmission import capability already. And that's what the capacity purchases is representing in the top bars here. Under the different scenarios, you're largely building wind and solar, and the amount of batteries increases if battery costs are lower than the base case. Otherwise, the model across all years is only selecting about a gigawatt of lithium-ion batteries to support the RA needs in that zone. Next slide. All right, so some key conclusions from this assessment. Number one is that RA challenges under these set of modeled load growth scenarios and retirements, RA challenges exist over the long term in both the regional markets and within Illinois zones. This is not just a temporary challenge. This is a long haul kind of challenge that we see. And even if you extend a lot of thermal plant operations, the plants in the broader footprints have been operating for decades already. So there is going to be an end of life replacement need for a lot of the generators in these two markets. What we see is that the through 2045, kind of significant new resources are required, and that needs to come from a mix of various new additions. We also see that delaying emissions-driven retirements of Illinois thermal resources by itself does not solve the RA problem. You still need additional resources over the mid and long term as well. And then across all the scenarios, we also see that a mix of commercially available technologies can chart a path forward that can, be part of achieving Illinois' decarbonization goals as well as the reliability needs, kind of with a full mix of the resources that we modeled. I think that's a good point to pause here then, before we talk about conclusions and next steps, Jim.
Great. Any questions on this next section that we just covered here, the long-term pieces? Philip, I see your hand up. Please come off mute and ask your question. Thanks.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Nate. Philip Golden, IAC. A question, in reading through this and reading through the report and listening to you, am I right in concluding that keeping some level of the current gas fleet will result in a least cost reliability solution? I understand there's need for additional resources, but as I understand it, your least cost solution involves keeping siege, what you called the siege delay, I guess was the name you gave it, or siege extension case. That's your least cost solution. Is that right?
We have not characterized that solution as a least cost solution, for a number of reasons. And we studied the change in the resource development need, that is triggered by the retention or retirement of those facilities. And the reason being is that the actual costs faced by Illinois consumers in a retail competitive market, which Illinois is, are largely driven and dictated by prevailing market prices, capacity market prices, and energy prices. And so, whether a plant is existing or new, those plants have different carrying costs, but the value of those plants and the effect of those plants on market prices is a lot more nuanced and complex. And so, that kind of cost analysis of specific options to address the RA need is anticipated to be part of the mitigation plan development. I see Brian came off mute here, so maybe I'll turn it over to him to comment any further.
Yeah, I think what you got into right there at the end is exactly what I was going to point out, is that I think we view this as having two phases. The purpose of the RA study and Nate's overview of what's in the RA study is to define effectively the gap that we face, and the purpose of the mitigation plan development, the IRP development, is to determine the optimal portfolio for filling that gap. And so that assessment is to come, and that's essentially in phase two, which is coming in the next few months. So that's how we're looking at the stages associated with it. And cost is one of a number of variables that are taken into account in determining what the optimal portfolio is. And that's part of the whole plan development process that we have facing us in 2026.
Let me clarify one other thing then, because apparently I misunderstood something in the analysis. When you talk about, for instance, being online by 2030, or something is available in 2030, is that online before 2030, like in 2029, 2028, or is that 2030 to 2035? Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing? If you go back and look at the bar charts that you just had up on, like in MISO Zone 4, like for instance, you're adding solar in 2035. You've got, I'll eyeball and say it's 3 gigawatts. Is that going to be online between 2031 and 2035, or is that 2035 onward? If you understand the question I'm asking, Nate.
I think that I do. So we, obviously every individual project and reliability, there's sort of peak reliability periods that are defined. So if you want to be meeting summer reliability, you have to be online by the summer period, right?
Sure.
Also, there are specific kind of inter-year, month-to-month retirements. This long-term portfolio modeling was, of course, a simplified version, so we weren't tracking everything on kind of a month-in, month-out level for additions and retirements. So this is a representation of these being online by this year, functionally, for the RA need.
Okay, so like that 3 megawatts of, then like 3 gigawatts of solar, that, and that's an eyeball, I'm not saying it's the right number, that's in the base case for MISO Zone 4 would be online by 2035.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Phil. I see another hand up from Chelsea. Chelsea, please come off mute and ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, this is Chelsea O'Tilling with Energy Futures Group. I just had two questions on the modeling inputs going into Plexus. First, on the ELCC and planning reserve margin values modeled for the MISO footprint, were those reflective of the seasonal construct? or were those applied annually? And second, on the capacity imports, were those seen as basically unconstrained for Plexus to be able to select as a addition in the capacity expansion step?
Yeah, let me answer that in two parts, kind of broadly for this the sake of time here, Chelsea. So I'd say part one in how we applied ELCCs, the capacity expansion modeling exercise used annual ELCCs, which we generated from our own loss of load, E3's loss of load probability model recap, which we've documented in the report. That model looks across all hours of the year, all seasons, to create an annual ELCC. Okay. So we are capturing winter risk and summer risk and all other risk elements in the probability distributions modeled in that model for an annual ELCC. And that's why we aligned those ELCCs with an annual planning reserve margin target to meet a 1 in 10 standard within the same model framework, right? And that's why those ELCCs are not directly comparable to those from the RTOs that are done on a seasonal basis with their own PRM counting. And we could get, really nerdy here when we talk about the slight differences in how E3 counts and accredits within our recap model of an ELCC based on an equivalent perfect megawatt of capacity for an LOLE frequency standard versus what the RTOs produce, which is a marginal reliability improvement expected unserved energy resource standard. And those they can come from the same model, but they're just slightly different ways of counting. And so whenever we apply an ELCC to a planning reserve margin, we need to be consistent with applying it in the same framework. And so we did that, and we applied RTO for the short-term balance projections. And then we used our own internally consistent modeling based on the same underlying, conceptual approach for loss of load probability modeling for a single annual number for capacity expansion. Hopefully that answers the first part of the question. The second part of your question was around the imports and the constraints and unconstrained imports. There is more detailed documentation of how these constraints were defined in the RA study, a technical appendix. I'd encourage you to read the study for that perspective. The short answer live on the call is that for the Illinois zones, we essentially set a planning reserve margin target constraint in the LT model to meet a in-zone requirement, with in-zone resources inclusive of the transfer capability. That is not the nameplate Pmax of the lines, but is actually a derated, version of that based on RTO values of what the on-peak transfer capability is into those zones.
And Nate, along those lines, we have two written questions. One is with regards to imports. So I'm going to hit that one first, just for the same vein here. How confident are you that imports to MISO LRZ4 will be available as other systems experience their own issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the whole purpose of the study was, and I think we fairly stated this conclusion in the study, that if the Illinois zones are only resource adequate if you include import capability, which is what we find, while the RTOs are not resource adequate or need more resources, then that is a risk. In other words, I am not entirely confident that those imports are there. That's part of the characterization of why this is a risk. It's a regional risk that drives a reliability concern for the state of Illinois. So that's, I guess, the brief answer to that. The other answer that is a bit more nuanced, but very important and relates to the same dynamic is that even if Illinois as a state were to build in-state resources such that there would be, quote, no reliance on import capability to show the stack of supply megawatts meeting the RTO's zonal reliability requirements, if the rest of the RTO is still short, then Illinois is still at risk because it's an interconnected system. In other words, a shortfall elsewhere in the market could pull generation out of Illinois as part of the market operations. That is part of being in a common interconnected synchronized power grid. So it's really important to understand that you're in the same boat in Illinois as the broader regional markets that you are a part of. And when we think about solutions and the cost and the physical reliability benefits of those solutions, it is pretty important to keep that aspect in mind as well.
And the last question for this section before we kind of close out with your conclusions is from Raj. He writes, when you model PJM and MISO to capture broader system reliability needs, What new interregional transmission resource additions did you assume for reliability transmission limits between Illinois zones and the broader RTO markets? Was it limited to the top RTO plan transmission additions?
So we included planned transmission projects and the transmission planning processes of both RTOs. And that's why, if you look at the assumptions around the increase in import capability to MISO 4 and ComEd zones in the model framework, we have some assumptions of an increase in that capability. It is not one to one with the expected kind of nameplate max megawatt additions, but it's scaled based on the ratio of basically the CETL to the Pmax of the transmission flows into the zones. I know it's a little bit jargony, but basically we took the existing transfer capability limits assumed for the capacity price models for MISO and PJM as the import limits for reliability counting, not maximum possible hourly flow, which is, of course, dependent on load flow conditions and a number of other factors. And that's what we used as the core input for the model, with some expected additions or increases to that, but only based on known projects.
Great. Thanks,
Also
Nate.
important to, again, highlight that we don't find transmission into Illinois to be a binding constraint, really, for resource adequacy with the generation sufficiency question. It is a matter not of a transmission into Illinois, but generation availability during critical times. That is the critical issue facing the broader markets.
Great point. Great cap to that. Last few slides here, then, and your conclusions, next steps.
Great. So, I mean, this is really just a restatement of the conclusions that I kicked off the summary with that appear in the executive summary. These RA challenges are regional in nature as well as in state. And we see, the analysis of options of what to do about these challenges, which is the purpose of this year's effort in the development of the mitigation plan. Was not, the RA study wasn't trying to answer that question. We were just trying to understand the nature and drivers and magnitude and timing of the risk. And that's what we've done to date to characterize that. And so with that in mind, I think some of these key challenging questions that I know you all have in your heads that are also in our minds too, regarding data centers and their amount of load flexibility, given that they're a big driver of new peak need. And what does that look like? How do different resource capacity accreditations look and change over time? We had an initial answer for this from our loss of load modeling in the study, and that probably requires some further development. But in addition to data centers and demand response associated with them, the nature of what generation resources can be added over time, and then what are the right options for Illinois in addressing this challenge, given the costs and physical reliability dynamics as being part of these broader systems. That aspect is a very critical element for the mitigation plan development. So I think I'll leave it there with asking some questions to the stakeholders represented here around what factors you all believe should be considered and explored in the development of the mitigation plan. The what do we do about this challenge? Any specific analyses or modeling approaches that were not already employed in the RA study. That includes any scenarios or sensitivities that you all feel are critically important to be addressed or show up. And if there are any data sources that you all wanted to, formally introduce in addition to those used in the RA study.
Yes.
Acting really weird.
So, Jim, I'll leave it there. Turn it back to you. You're on mute currently.
Appreciate it. One of the notes we have at the bottom here to also kind of allay kind of comment and concerns here, because there's a lot of you on the call, and I'm sure you all have different opinions about sensitivities and additional scenarios and designs. This is going to be part of our formal request for written response. So you'll all have an opportunity to submit kind of your written recommendations, things to think about, and so on. In the interest of time, so we can get to this next section, which is also important as we stage going forward, going to kind of move forward here. Brian, you are next up. The next section here is going to be the resource adequacy studies element on the mitigation plan development.
Great. Thanks, Jim. I'm getting a prompt here that says that I have to restart my computer to get my camera back working again. So I'm assuming this has to do with some update prompt that I just got about an hour ago on my operating system. Live TV, folks. So a couple things just to say, kind of basic principles to start off with. I think we want this to be the first of many touch points going forward. Ultimately, we want this to be a place where the conversation starts in light of the plan that we published, but certainly not where the conversation ends. And we hope to be transparent and communicative across the different steps that follow. We'll have additional workshops and comment processes where appropriate, as we'll get into the coming slides. But we really appreciate everyone's engagement today, and we certainly appreciate the work that E3 has done. I think done a great service to the state in leveraging their expertise to help Illinois residents, businesses, everybody who's concerned about resource adequacy here. So we really thank Nate and his team for the work that they did in putting together this modeling analysis. So we go to the first slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about mitigation plan requirements. So as Jim and Nate have gone over, what we're required to do right now, based upon the finding in the RA study, is develop a mitigation plan. But what is a mitigation plan? And I think we can think of it as having a plan that has solutions in two different buckets. The first is a plan to reduce or delay CO2 and copollutant emissions requirements reductions copollutant emissions reductions requirements. In other words, extending emissions reductions deadlines through the mitigation plan itself. And that is something that can be effectuated through the ICC's order in approving the mitigation plan. And the second is considering the use of renewable energy, energy storage, demand response, transmission development, or other strategies to resolve the identified resource adequacy shortfall or reliability violation. So we kind of think of this as there's a gap or a hole that we're faced with. We have different solutions available to us in order to be able to fill that. Then the question is, how do we optimize the portfolio that's used to try to fill that gap? That gets into the commission's standard of review. I think there is a place you can look to say, does the plan that we put together then actually satisfy what the law requires of us? And from the standard review, that plan, the mitigation plan, has to resolve the deficiency at the least amount of emissions, taking into consideration environmental justice community impacts, and ensure adequate, reliable, efficient, and environmentally sustainable electric service at the lowest total cost over time, taking into account the impact of emissions increases. There's a number of different qualitative characteristics at issue there, some of which may be at tension with each other. I think it gets into kind of this concept of both art and science. There's a lot of science associated with how it is that we assess whether a certain solution satisfies criteria. Then there's a bit of art associated with how you balance all of those things in order to determine the optimal portfolio. So I think going forward, we're looking at this and saying we want to develop a solution set that takes into account cost, certainty of resources being developed, timing, emissions impact environmental justice communities. There's no publishing deadline for the mitigation plan, but it is due to be filed with the ICC 90 days after the draft is published. There's a 60-day comment process, and then 30 days for revising the mitigation plan after it is published, and then 180 days by statute for litigating the plan at the ICC. So we have this plan that's required under Section 9.150 of the Illinois Environmental Protection Act that has us basically developing a plan to meet our resource adequacy needs and considering both emissions reduction requirement delays as well as different supply, demand side, and transmission alternatives. With that, we go to the next slide, which talks about integrated resource planning. And we have new integrated resource planning requirements coming from SERJA, which takes effect on June 1st. And as you look at what this requires from the state, it's very similar to what's found in the mitigation plan. We have to fully understand our current and future resource adequacy needs, and we have to plan for what resources could be utilized to address those needs. I picked up a few quotes and put those into slides here, but there's a lot of other quotes that kind of take you in the same direction across Section 16201 and 202 of the Public Utilities Act. And you can kind of see that effectively we're engaged in the same exercise through the IRP development process. There's the evaluation of electric resource needs, including peak demand forecasts, assessment of different load growth scenarios. You look to the range of supply options available across the first 5 years. You have a focus on the timing of resource deployment. You're trying to take into account impacts from and options for demand side alternatives. You make an assessment of the emissions impact of those different portfolios. You make an assessment of customer cost impacts. You make an assessment of the impacts in environmental justice communities, just as you do for the mitigation plan development process. And the plan must then meet reserve margin requirements, which essentially means the plan must answer then exactly what it is that you need to fill your resource adequacy gap. There's the same sort of portfolio optimization exercise with the IRP as with the mitigation plan. There are these different characteristics that are called out expressly in statute in both affordability, reliability, equity, emissions reduction. There's some similarity in process. The biggest difference is that with the IRP process, you have the ability to effectuate more alternatives. With the mitigation plan, you have the ability to effectuate a delay in the emission reduction requirement deadlines. But with the IRP process, you have the ability to expand programs, develop new programs, and help facilitate different alternatives and different supply alternatives. The IRP must be filed with the ICC by November 15th of 2026. There is a 180-day proceeding called for by statute there as well, but that can be extended by an additional 180 days. So I think as we look at it, we look at two different processes happening around the same time. So go to the next slide. And the question I think that prompts for us is then how do we do both of these processes at once? And what are the governing principles that we want to employ in both developing a mitigation plan and developing an integrated resource plan? Number one, I think we want to focus on efficiency of process. We understand that all of your time is limited, your resources are limited. Trying to synthesize workshops and comment processes where possible. I think at the outset, we'll see some divergence as we start to set the stage. But as we get deeper into it, ideally, we can start to merge some of these processes. I think ideally, we're also synthesizing litigation and briefings so that people aren't litigating two different dockets, having witnesses operating in both, potentially paying the same witnesses for both. Synergies and modeling and assumptions, I think, are very important, making sure that we're using consistent load forecasts, make sure that our picture of what supply is scheduled to come online is consistent across the two. We don't want two different records emerging. And similarly, we don't want two different administrative outcomes. I think if you have an order in one proceeding that basically has certain guidance and an order in another proceeding that has guidance that's at tension with that first proceeding, that will cause delay and uncertainty for all parties. And we try to avoid that where we can. So I think our idea here is that what we should try to do is consolidate these two processes to the extent that we can. We're already starting to get some of the work done on the mitigation plan. I know we'll have some discussion a little bit later about what's happening with the ARP process next. There's some difference in terms of the solutions that we can employ for both, but I think our objective here is to try to take these two routes that have started out in different places that are trying to cover the same things and converge them and consolidate them to the extent that we can. So go to the next slide. So for mitigation plan development, this is a tentative schedule that we put together about basically what comes next. And the first thing that will happen is we'll issue some questions for comments. You saw that as a preview on a previous slide. And we recognize that we didn't have a draft RA study published in November. That was something that we hope to do and take feedback on that draft study. But if there are items that you think we didn't assess properly as part of the RA study, we do want to see your comments on those. I know we've seen a few come up today around how we incorporated energy efficiency in, additive transmission resources, extreme weather events. All of these items we'd love your written feedback on in the coming weeks. We're not going to redo the study by any means, but we will at least take those into account and use those, if warranted, as guidance for the plans that we develop from that point forward. I think across April and June, we can see a scenario where we start getting into a little bit different work around scenario modeling, defining solution sets, starting to compare different solutions against each other. And then as the summer rolls on, that becomes comparing them against each other across different vectors. So taking into account cost, taking into account timing, taking into account emissions reductions, power, all of those things start to paint the picture where then you can draft a mitigation plan that has a more optimized portfolio set. And ideally, you're starting to merge that process with the IRB process by the summer, by September or so. So go to the next slide. So from there, I know Jim will talk a little bit about the comment process that we have coming up and what comes up from here. But this is at least our vision for how we can take this mitigation plan responsibility, marry that with the integrated resource planning process, and make sure that we come away not having everyone double up their work, but trying to make sure that this attempt to try to optimize portfolio is happening across maybe one stream to the extent that we can.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm going to jump forward a few slides to kind of bridge that point, and we have about 5 minutes before we need to work on wrapping up, hitting the 2 hour mark here. And my quick jump here, we'll hit these other slides I just jumped over, but It goes to some of the stakeholder questions. So Nate had already queued up the technical piece. We'll have those coming out in written format. And to Brian's point, from the mitigation plan process, there's high-level concept designs. And if anyone has initial thoughts or feedback, things to consider, you can raise your hand and we can initially start that conversation here. Obviously, it needs a lot of thought and discussion by all of you hearing it, likely for the first time. The first is seeking feedback on how to optimally merge the two processes, as Brian mentioned, the two being the mitigation plan as a result of the RA study process we're currently in now and the IRP process that'll be preeminently led by the ICC in consultation with the other agencies like the IPA going forward through the summer into the fall. And then you have the second point here of seeking feedback on considerations to manage. So the broader considerations, things we need to be thinking about or should be thinking about as we look at how to balance these, the roles and requirements in the RA study process, that is mitigation plan now, versus that of the IRP and how we balance those. So I'll open it up to folks if they have any questions at this point or comments at this point that may help the conversation. Otherwise, these will be put out for written feedback in the next week or so, and there'll be a comment process I'll talk about in a second. Let me just take a second here and see if anyone has some initial thoughts or ideas. See a hand raised by James. James, please come off mute and ask your question or provide comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. James Geniak with Union of Concerned Scientists. Will the same consultant team be working on both the mitigation plan and the IRP?
So I won't speak on behalf of the ICC folks because they're managing what that will look like and the timing associated with that. I can't speak for that. However, E3 will be working on behalf of the IPA in support of the mitigation plan and at a minimum supporting us as well through the IRP process. We just have to see how the evolution of the ICC process goes. Given Surge's timing and what I understand, what the RFP process could be for the ICC, and I think there's a few folks on like Joy who could probably speak a little bit more to that. There are some additional considerations surrounding timing. I think Jim Zolniak is also on.
Jim,
Yes.
can you hear me? This is Joy.
Hey, Joy.
Hi. Thank you for the question. We just are in a bit of a conundrum in that because the CRGA was passed during the veto session, the effective date is in June 1, 2026. Therefore, our agency is unable to currently get the services of a consultant to work on this. We hope to address that in a few months, and our hope, at least my hope, is that we will be able to get a consulting team that will be working well with E3 if it's not E3. But just keep watching our IRP webpage. Thank you. I see it. I think it's right after this slide that Jim has. There's some information there. We invite everybody to please respond to our first request for comments. Those comments are going to be sent to a broad list of stakeholders, mostly the list here for the resource adequacy study. But before then, could you please all just check out our webpage? The requests for comments are there posted as well.
Thanks, Joy. So when this gets posted to, you can obviously look at what the link is here, but you'll have the link when we post the files if you haven't seen this already. To Joy's points, I see a hand raised by Scott. Yes, Scott, come off mute and ask your question or comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. First of all, thank you to the E3 team, to Nate, for a very clear explanation. When I put his explanation and the timelines that Brian just laid out together, um, and asking myself, were regional shortages for any reason whatsoever to develop um, import capacity, interconnection speed, the other reasons that were raised today, um, in let's say the 2 year time frame, 27 and 28, should Illinois not be ready with the ideal strategy at the outer end of these timeframes added together, what authority does the state have to act more quickly? My other concern, and I'll raise these questions formally as you just suggested as well, but it does seem to me that uh, if we get hit with an emergency outside of our control, well, resilience is about dealing with what both is expected and modeled and known and what may not be known. Other people raised other issues outside of our control. So if the limits of the modeling that were explained are the answers to these questions that have been raised today by me and others, will the work to create a mitigation plan be able to go outside of those limits? Whether it's meshing together before and behind the meter resources, looking at a more granular set of choices, acceleration options, in this wonderful category, which is going to become my favorite, of other alternatives. I know how long it takes right now because it's being well documented to order and deliver gas turbines and wind generators and solar at various scales and nuclear. Um, but it just seems that we haven't done diligence in this study process yet on how long it might take to deliver a portfolio of these other alternatives. And without that, how ready then is Illinois? Should shortages really develop at the front end of that 5-year period instead of at the back end?
Appreciate it, Scott. Two good points. So I'll say this is part or will be part of the next segment as we go through mitigation plans. So maybe in kind of reverse order here. From the mitigation plan standpoint, we're going to be looking at some of these items. So it's what are the solution sets? How quickly can the solution sets be affected? What are the costs associated with those? And trying to find an ideal solution. What should be considered, though, is also what's the driver of 9.150 versus what's kind of a flipped consideration or orientation of the IRP process that'll be mapped out. Like, more specifically, what are the solutions that can be done in one versus the other? The mitigation plan point and what 9.150 really maps out for us is a drive to the emission standards and that of potentially delayed retirements or things of that nature, which is a solution. It is a component or consideration, but it's not the full suite that the 9.150 actually also maps out and says consider all these other things. The IRP is intended to consider all of these things. So that's definitely a consideration of this next stage, not just of the mitigation plan as you've kind of mapped, but also the IRP over what periods of time, what's available, when, why, and what are the considerations or the flex points? Are there things that are a risk? They may be available. To your point, you mentioned, turbine availability. It's definitely something that needs to be considered because it could have or be a limiter on the availability of, say, gas resources. Even in other states, if other states are doing things, to points put in the chat about the availability of imports from other states at any point in time, they may be factoring in their own considerations that we need to evaluate. But then there's other or broader ones. There's renewable related assets. There's how quickly can you bring on storage, demand response mentions earlier, like yourself and others, of energy efficiency. So that's part of the intermix of things that we really need to consider in the solution set that wasn't part of the first phase of just saying, could there and is there likely to be a shortfall under certain conditions? Kind of in then the second order is how quickly we need to kind of work through that. There are, again, different options and opportunities that the mitigation plan through the RA study process is trying to solve or drive forward to, that the IRP is a little different, broader, intentionally so, touching on a number of different areas, not just on things that, say, the IPA can affect through its plans, but also others, be it the utilities or other states and programs and things. And I know, Brian, you and I have talked about a lot of these kind of just amongst ourselves. I don't know if you have any other thoughts that you wanted to kind of add to the structure.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is just that even if you developed a mitigation plan more quickly, the thing that it could do through the commission's order approving the plan is change the 2030 emission reduction requirements. But that's a 2030 emission reduction requirement. So you may see the same resources online from 2027, 2028, 2029, either way. The IRP is the mechanism that allows for the expansion of other alternatives. So if you're looking at some other option available through our state to address a resource adequacy need, demand side, supply side, transmission, whatever it might be, the IRP is the avenue for effectuating that, but the mitigation plan order could only recommend it. So
Yep.
that I think that's an important distinction to draw.
Thanks, Brian. I know we're at time. I see one hand up. Let's get through one more question. Jason, if you want to come off mute and kind of quickly provide your comment. And again, I recommend everybody, if you have additional thoughts and comments, please submit them in written format just so we can also kind of hear from you and also provide response from there. So, Jason.
Thanks, Jim. A quick question. In the RA study, E3 only considered existing technologies and excluded resources like long duration storage and other emerging resources. Are you envisioning that the mitigation plan will be an opportunity to consider the resources like long duration storage? Is that something you're open to considering, or is that, in your view, better considered in the IRP or only to be considered in the IRP?
So I'm going to say in all of the above. So from a recommendation standpoint, please, provide ideas, both long duration storage. There could be other technologies and options and ideas put forward as well. As Nate had also mentioned in the underlying study that we did, nuclear is another one, for example. But that's at a longer time frame and with certain assumptions and limitations on that. So I'd say in all of the above is definitely up for consideration. If you have additional thoughts or ideas, or any of you do, please submit those because we want to have a mix of things and different ideas over different periods of time of when they could be available and why, as well as other limitations or opportunities from them. There could be cost, time. It also might be an evolution of them. So they may not be ready for utility scale operational use today, but it's on the cusp of that. So there's a number of things that are to be determined, or we need to purposely project out for future years that may not be available by 2031, but it might be by 2035 or 2040. So definitely up for consideration, and thoughts and ideas about, for example, the long duration storage, what type and where.
Yeah, and I think that goes not just for long duration storage, but any other alternative.
Absolutely.
If you think we haven't properly considered something, make the case to us in comments as to why you think it's feasible, why you think it fits the need, and then ultimately, if you look at statute, why you think it's the least cost alternative, has the best emissions profile, all of those things that are called out in statute. I think we're open to, the law says other strategies. So I think we're open to any additional ideas that weren't considered through the RA study.
Yeah, absolutely. Any and all ideas, please put them forward. All right, so recognizing we're a few minutes past, just a quick recap for folks on next steps. So first, we're going to have a release of stakeholder questions, as we now mentioned a few times here. So please look out for that. We will be issuing an announcement or communication. So anyone that's on the IPA's RA study distribution list, you'll get that and see that. I implore you to go out if you're not already there and sign up for that. Additionally, they'll be posted on our website under the RA study section. So you can also check back for that. Potential additional workshops. So we're looking at having additional workshops going forward. If I quick jump back to the slide that Brian had here with the mitigation plan schedule, we don't have the dates of them specifically, but we will be having a number of workshops to solicit additional information, thoughts, ideas, also communicate where we're at depending on the stage of things. So the April or June timeframe, we're likely to have a workshop roughly in that range as we start to define scenarios and so on to seek feedback. And again, when it comes up to solution sets, we want to provide draft solution sets and get feedback from all of you on what that looks like. So at least two workshops are likely in the next, say, 6 to, what is that, 8, 9 months. But the exact dates and times will be communicated going forward in the future. Oops. And then, one of the other things that we're really trying to do throughout this is reemphasize consistency and transparency, gain that engagement from all of you and across the IRP process. So as we move into the question section, please keep an eye and a thought or mindset toward that, especially when it comes to the plan process. We're really looking for feedback and the best way to align these to ensure they're working in tandem together, as is the intention. So I already went through these. If you have any additional questions or comments, again, please submit them. And Joy had gone through the IRP. I'll give her a last plug here. Go out to their website. You can sign up for that. The workshop's coming up February 18th from 1 to 3. There's also a question set that's out there in preparation for that. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance, participation, support today, and for many of you in the prior workshops and RA process and then going forward. Again, thank you and have a great rest of your day.